B. Collins.
That's me. Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Tuesday, November 17th, 2020. In case you haven't heard, we're in the final phase of the PBC News and Comment podcast. The last one will be a week from tomorrow. That's next Wednesday, November 25th. So there's a big question circulating right now. Will Joe Biden allow prosecution, an appropriate investigation of the crimes of the Trump era? Not limited to the president himself, but those who have enabled his illegal acts. And I feel very strongly about this. And I have a feeling that Joe Biden is going to repeat the big blunder of Barack Obama and say, well, you know, it's going to divide the nation. It's too messy. We want to be looking forward, not backward. And that was the excuse that Obama used to investigate and prosecute 0 Wall Street criminals after the meltdown of 2008, when they knew they were peddling toxic securities. And likewise, he failed to investigate or prosecute the torture regime under George W. Bush. And what did we end up with? A CIA director who was directly involved in the torture program. That's Gina Haspel. Bloody Gina Haspel. And I'm old enough to remember when Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon. And while everybody said, oh, it's for the good of the nation, it's for healing, it allows brazen wrongdoing by subsequent presidents. And unless we draw a clear, bright line and say that as a nation, we will not tolerate law-breaking by a president and his associates, we're going to have more of it. Maybe there is Democratic guilt over the way Russiagate was used to try to destabilize, if not eject, Donald Trump's presidency. But the way Trump stonewalled on the Ukraine narrative that led to his impeachment and the stonewalling of the United States Senate, which I think did permanent damage to our Constitution. If we allow this to go unaddressed and just say, well, you know, Cy Vance, Manhattan District Attorney, Letitia James, Attorney General of New York, they'll get him. And it is possible that Trump and the entire entourage will be pardoned either by Trump or through a maneuver by allowing Mike Pence to be president for a minute, long enough to sign the pardon and commutation documents. So to me, this is a very significant issue. I know who Joe Biden is, and in a minute we'll get to some of the people, or at least a glance at the way he is populating his cabinet and administration. And it's going to be really ugly from a progressive point of view. We know that. But this is a foundational issue that can't just be wished away, can't just be dismissed. So according to an NBC report, Biden has privately told advisors he doesn't want his presidency to be consumed by investigations of his predecessor. He's raised concerns that investigations would further divide a country he is trying to unite and risk making every day of his presidency about Trump. Well, look, as long as Twitter allows that son of a bitch to have an account, Trump is going to make every day about Trump as long as we let him. And I know his mob cult will slavishly follow every tweeted word. Let him. There is not going to be immediate unity in this country. And it cannot be achieved by conceding Trump's gross violations of the law. Back to the NBC report, Biden has specifically told advisors he's wary of federal tax investigations of Trump or of challenging any orders Trump may issue granting immunity to members of his staff before he leaves office. One advisor said Biden has made it clear he just wants to move on. Biden has said he wants his Justice Department to function independently. Well, if that's the case, let him. Let them do their diligence, investigate, and prosecute as indicated. And I felt Obama obstructed justice. He was never called on it because the Democrats fell into line and the Republicans got what they wanted. Biden's team is also reluctant, NBC says, to send any signal to Trump officials that the Justice Department won't look into their actions, given that there's still 9 weeks until the inauguration. Well, that's a mixed message. We want you to think we might prosecute you until January 20th. I'm sorry, that is incoherent. Now, Biden had said many times during the campaign that he would leave any decision whether to prosecute Trump up to his attorney general. And he has said that he wouldn't pardon Trump should he be convicted of any crimes. Now, I realize some of this is speculative because the federal issues may be just whisked away through the process I described of either Trump trying to pardon himself and leaving that up to courts to decide the validity of, or handing the baton briefly to Mike Pence and having him do the dirty deed. That might end Mike Pence's hopes to be president himself, but he appears to be obsequious enough to do whatever he's told. So, in the New York Times Magazine, published online today, there is a lengthy analysis under the byline of Jonathan Mahler. And he, in great detail, weighs the pros and cons, the history. He describes how Biden, in his first speech as president-elect, said it's time to heal. He refers to the Ford pardon of Nixon that I did. He talks about the prospect of state-level prosecution in New York, which cannot be blocked by a federal pardon. He notes that Trump cavalierly has called for imprisonment of his political opponents, shattering a long-standing Democratic norm. He refers to the Obama. He doesn't call it a blunder like I do, but he refers to that episode. Said that many people are content for the true moment of reckoning to be the outcome of the election. He argues against saying that a damage to democracy would be caused by a failed prosecution is hard to even fathom. He said an acquittal could set back future efforts at accountability. I don't worry too much about that. Putting him on trial for his conduct as president would be tantamount to putting on trial the more than 72 million Americans who voted for his reelection. I'm sorry, that's bullshit. They didn't build the government for bottled water at Mar-a-Lago. He continues here, prosecuting Trump could complicate any effort to restore the Justice Department's reputation for independence and integrity. That's flatly opposite what I believe. If you want to restore the credibility of the Justice Department, let it go find some justice. Stop pulling punches. Stop limiting what it can or cannot do. And he adds, prosecuting a former president could mean convicting him, and the idea of sending a former president to prison does indeed seem fantastical. Well, let those chips fall where they may. I have a strong sense that a conviction would be enough and that a judge, particularly a Trump appointee, would not sentence the Donald and his hair to prison. I mean, come on. He couldn't get the hair mousse that he needs in there. So I have linked to Mahler's piece. I think it is interesting. It is detailed. And he doesn't dismiss the possibility at all. I think he gives heavier weight to the arguments against. But his conclusion is, the problem that Trump poses for Biden may also present an opportunity, a chance to repair more than just the damage of the last 4 years. To begin with, this may require recognizing that when a president brazenly flouts the law, electoral defeat might not be enough punishment. He quotes Stephen Vladeck, the legal beagle from UT Austin. There's a mindset that we need to reset, Vladeck said. Breaking the law is not a political difference. It might also require recognizing that to really move on from Trump, healing may have to mean something fundamentally different from what it has in the past, and that without accountability, it may in fact be impossible. It's a long way from the start of that article to that conclusion. I'm not sure how many people actually read that final paragraph. And here's just the latest accounting of Trump's brazen heist from the taxpayers and from his campaign funds. The magazine Forbes, which proudly calls itself Capitalist Tool, has broken down that under the Federal Election Commission filings, the richest president in American history has now moved $2.3 million of contributions from other people into his private companies. And they break it down. And then there are the issues of the way we have been billed as taxpayers for events at the Washington Hotel. We won't even talk about presidential travel. But in total, Forbes says that from the Republican National Committee, the president's joint fundraising committees, that there's been a total of $4.7 million that has gone to the Trump entities since he took office. And they estimate that the total now reaches almost $7 million. Now, these are not small amounts of money. He claims to be so incredibly rich that this couldn't possibly matter to him. But we know that he's highly leveraged. He's tight on cash. He didn't contribute a dime to his own cash-strapped re-election campaign this year. So, it is criminal, and we need to treat it as such. Now, Trump has followed through on a campaign pledge to try to bring the troops home from Afghanistan and Iraq. And he's clearly been battling with generals and the non-military people at the Pentagon. So he had to fire Mark Esper, the previous defense secretary. Plugged in this guy, Chris Miller, a week ago. And today, you couldn't even see the strings, the puppet strings, as Miller announced that we're going to reduce the number of uniformed people in Afghanistan by half to 2,500, and by 500 in Iraq, from 3,000 to 2,500. And in a moment, we'll note that those numbers may not even be accurate. So Miller gave this lofty comment: "We owe this moment to the many patriots who made the ultimate sacrifice and our comrades who carry forward their legacy. Together we have mourned the loss of more than 6,900 American troops who gave their lives in Afghanistan and Iraq, and we will never forget the more than 52,000 who bear the wounds of war and all those who still carry its scars, visible and invisible." Now, I am not opposed to this. It is a messy, last-minute way to do it. It could upend the wobbly talks with the Taliban that now involve the Afghan government, which is wobbly in its own way. And so far in the coverage I've seen, nobody mentions that Liz Cheney got together with some Democrats in the House, passed an amendment to the current funding bill for the Pentagon, which set impossible standards before any president could withdraw more troops from Afghanistan or Iraq, and I think even Germany was included. So I don't know how that gets reconciled. And the other issue here is when we look at these troop counts, I mentioned yesterday that Aaron Mate, the progressive journalist, appeared on Tucker Carlson's show last Friday night. One of the issues they discussed is how the ambassador or special envoy to Syria, James Jeffrey, has been bragging recently about how he and others basically deceived Trump. Quote, "We were always playing shell games to not make clear to our leadership how many troops we had there. The actual number of troops in northeast Syria is a lot more than the 200 troops Trump agreed to leave there in 2019. I thought it was 150. Jeffrey continued, "What Syria withdrawal? There never was a Syria withdrawal. When the situation in northeast Syria had been fairly stable after we defeated ISIS, Trump was inclined to pull out. In each case, we then decided to come up with 5 better arguments for why we needed to stay, and we succeeded both times. That's the story." So Caitlin Johnstone, the American critic who resides in Australia and has our number, she says this would not be the first time that Jeffrey, a foreign policy insider with the past 3 administrations, has admitted to deceiving the public about what's happening in Syria. Earlier this year, he admitted at a Hudson Institute video event that contrary to the official public narrative of the U.S. military being in Syria to fight terrorism, it's actually there to create, quote, "a quagmire for the Russians." What's this, payback for Afghanistan in the 1980s? And Johnstone continues, "On the one hand, there's been a nonstop deluge of articles since Trump's election saying anyone who dares to suggest the existence of a deep state in America is a conspiracy kook. But on the other hand, there's also been a constant praise for the insider adults in the room who ensure from within the administration that Trump doesn't demolish America's precious norms while in office." And she continues, "This cognitive two-step became even more reified after comments from the likes of Iraq War architect Bill Kristol, tweeting that he'd prefer the deep state to the Trump state." And Johnstone argues that deep state as a term has become almost meaningless. In reality, it's meant to refer not to anyone who opposes Trump, nor to a secret cabal of baby-eating Satanists, but simply to the tendency among government agencies and plutocrats to form loose alliances with each other and collaborate toward common agendas. It's a term used for political analysis to describe large-scale power agendas that are largely playing out right in the open. She says it's mostly unelected power establishment, which operates in the interests of imperialist expansionism and oligarchic control, with the official elected government operating sort of like the unplugged video game controller you hand your kid brother to keep him from whining for a chance to play. And follow the link in the show file for today's podcast to the Johnstone article with the picture of 3 brothers seated on a couch in front of a TV. And it's the baby who's got the video game controller that's plugged into nothing. That's a pretty apt description. So we've been speculating about the purge and repopulation of civilian leadership at the Pentagon. The troop withdrawals I just mentioned appear to be one motive. But Trump last week convened a meeting in the Oval Office in between his television shows and his sulking, and he asked senior advisors whether he had options to take action against Iran's main nuclear site before the 20th of January. A range of senior advisors reportedly dissuaded the president from moving ahead with a military strike. The cool heads include Mike Pence with that fly on his head, Mike Pompeo, Chris Miller, the new acting defense secretary, Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, they warned that a strike against Iran's facilities could easily escalate into a broader conflict in the final weeks of Trump's presidency. And Trump asked his top national security aides what options would be available. So we're led to believe that cooler minds talked him down. But with Trump, as I've told you and warned you before, we haven't seen bottom. He's been frequently willing to ignore all of the advice that is submitted to him because he's the stable genius here, right? So we go back to the end of the Bush administration where Dick Cheney was hammering W for an attack on Iran, and he wanted a pardon for Scooter Libby, and W said no to both of those. But we will be watching vigilantly. And Iran is warning of a strong response if Trump goes ahead with any plan to strike Iran. Iranian government spokesman Ali Rabiei, you pronounce it, warned against such an attack. Any action against the Iranian nation would certainly face a crushing response. Now, they do have a lot of options. We have a lot of soft targets in Iraq, and Saudi Arabia has proven quite vulnerable. So there are ways for Iran to respond that would, raise serious costs for a U.S. military strike. In the region, the Palestinian Authority seems buoyed by the election victory of Joe Biden and announced today that it's resuming cooperation with Israel, ending a 6-month suspension of that cooperation, which really was a hardship for tens of thousands of Palestinians in the West Bank, because one of the critical suspensions was money transfers from Israel. Israel collects taxes from the Palestinians, but like a strong father, they dispense the money, and they can be kind of vicious in how they do it and when they cut it off. Represents about $100 million a month in taxes. And this has led to salary cuts for tens of thousands of public sector employees on the Palestinian side. So I'm happy for a reduction in the suffering of the Palestinian population. And I think it was Carl Howard who linked me up to this article at Mondoweiss. I've long criticized the way American legislators, both at the federal and state level, have caved to Israeli interests and, in violation of our First Amendment rights, passed laws that punish people who mount boycotts or sanctions against the state of Israel. So we're allowed to boycott states who pass laws about transgender bathrooms. We can engage in all sorts of boycotts, but not the special state of Israel. So here's how this is coming into play. You may know who Abby Martin is. She is a bright and beautiful reporter, and she was invited to Georgia State this year in February. They offered her a $1,000 honorarium to come and speak. But she was disinvited because she advocates for boycott, divestment, sanctions, BDS, aimed at Israel. But Georgia has a law called the Combating BDS Act of 2019. And that law set a threshold of $1,000 as the amount of money that would trigger penalties for people found in violation of the Georgia law. So at the behest of an Israeli diplomat, a lawmaker in Georgia, whose name is Representative Deborah Silcox. She introduced a modification to the bill, an amendment, which would raise the floor of contracts governed by the law from $1,000, which is what Abby Martin lost, to $100,000, which would end her lawsuit and kill any appeal of First Amendment issues. Now, this is a dirty deed being done dirt cheap. And Deborah Silcox even invited an Israeli consular officer to the hearing. She pointed at him. She said, "This is what Israel wants." Here's a quote. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do want to introduce briefly Harold Hirschberg, who's here with me with the Israeli consulate. I appreciate him coming down this morning to join us." She goes on to say that Israel asked her to raise the monetary limit. This is foreign meddling in order to stifle free speech in the United States. This is odious and reprehensible. I doubt if anybody else is even talking about this, much less raising alarm bells about what it really portends. And also, Carl Howard hooked me up to this story at truthout.org, published, looks like a couple of days ago. What I'm about to describe resembles what Israeli groups have done on American college campuses very effectively, stifling speech, stifling protests in favor of BDS aimed at Israel. And I want to make it clear, this group that I'm about to talk about, called Campus Reform, doesn't have any overt connections to Israel or supporters of Israel. But it is quite similar. It is modeled on, I think, the Israeli offensives, and it is funded by the Kochs. Campus Reform trains conservative students to monitor, surveil, and report on the speech and actions of left-leaning professors, students, and campus activist groups for the organization's daily blog. And that blog often gets picked up by Breitbart and Fox News. And it reminds me of the kind of anti-democratic actions that David Horowitz has been promoting over the years. I still regret giving him an interview. It was over 25 years ago, but he is a dirty dog. He plays dirty. He says, "Oh, I used to be a leftist, and then I grew up and got smarter." And he is so full of shit. So the article asks, what is Campus Reform? It is a project of the Leadership Institute, a 41-year-old organization founded by right-winger Morton C. Blackwell, an ally of Paul Weyrich. And Weyrich was the name I was trying to summon yesterday when I talked about the long-running Republican efforts at limiting voter participation. He was the one who really advanced the whole idea of restricting voter participation as a way to elect conservatives and Republicans. At any rate, Richard Viguerie, the right-wing political direct mail guy, and the president of the Heritage Foundation, now a former president, they were all involved in starting the campus group, Campus Reform. And what they do is when they get a line of attack against a professor or a student, they do a full frontal assault online. They contact the administration. They try to get the person fired or, expelled. And some leftists who've been on the receiving end of this have kind of figured it out, developed strategies for dealing with it. And the idea that Campus Reform helps train so-called journalists who just happen to be far right in their politics. One of the critics, a professor who has taken them on, and his name is Isaac Kamola. He's at Trinity College. He said, "This is not journalism. It's pure manufactured outrage. They come out and accuse people critical of racism of being un-American. They get donors to fund beachhead institutes on campus and take comments out of context to generate, 'Can you believe they said that?' fury, with no attempt to understand context or the arguments being voiced." So I've linked to this article in the show file for today's podcast. Take a look if you dare. So Lindsey Graham has really stepped in it. And this is fascinating because this is Republican on Republican. So if you know who Brad Raffensperger is, that's the way Greg Palast likes to pronounce his name. It's Raffensperger. He is the Republican Secretary of State of Georgia. And he did his damnedest. Greg Palast sued him over the voter purge of people Raffensperger claimed had moved when they, in fact, had not moved. Nevertheless, they were stripped off the voter rolls, and he did his best before the election to rig Georgia for Trump and the Republicans. But the heavy voter turnout, the organizing, it overcame the margin of graft. So Lindsey Graham, who got reelected despite Jamie Harrison's best efforts. He chairs the Senate Judiciary Committee, and he has no basis to reach out to Raffensperger in Georgia. He also made a call to the governor of Arizona and one other state that could be in dispute if you believe the Republican claims of election fraud. But when Graham called Raffensperger, according to Raffensperger, Lindsey asked him if he had the power to toss all mail ballots in counties found to have higher rates of signature issues on the mail-in ballots. Raffensperger said he was stunned that Graham appeared to suggest that he find a way to toss out legally cast ballots. Absent court intervention, Raffensperger doesn't have the power to do that because counties actually administer the elections in Georgia. The Secretary of State basically just presides over the county operations. So to his credit, Raffensperger has stood up. He's also stood up to the Republican senators Perdue and Loeffler, who demanded his resignation because he didn't deliver the election to Trump. And this appears to be a serious potential crime. Here's a citation from Georgia law. A person commits the offense of criminal solicitation to commit election fraud in the first degree when, with intent that another person engage in conduct constituting a felony under this article, he or she solicits, requests, commands, importunes, or otherwise attempts to cause the other person to engage in such conduct. That seems to fit here. And over at Crew in Washington, Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, Noah Bookbinder says, for the chairman of the Senate committee charged with oversight of our legal system to have reportedly suggested that an election official toss out large numbers of legal ballots from American voters is appalling. Not only is it wrong for Senator Graham to apparently contemplate illegal behavior, but his suggestion undermines the integrity of our elections and the faith the American people have in our democracy. Under the guise of rooting out election fraud, it looks like Graham is suggesting committing it. That is unacceptable, and Graham should step down from his chairmanship immediately. And that will only happen if the Democrats pull off twin upsets on January 5th and elect the two Democratic candidates for senator from Georgia. And we get an additional quote here. Raffensperger told CNN that his conversation with Graham, it was just an implication of look hard and see how many ballots you could throw out. Now, Graham told The Hill that the claim is just ridiculous and that Raffensperger felt threatened by that conversation, that he's got a problem. Quoting Graham, I actually thought it was a good conversation, adding that he was surprised to hear Raffensperger characterize it the way he did. And he said, yeah, I talked to Arizona, I talked to Nevada. And in the case of Arizona, he later clarified that he spoke to the governor, Doug Ducey, not the Secretary of State after she denied having any phone call from Graham. So I want to correct a misimpression that I have been repeatedly stating in the last 10 days or so related to a potential recount in Wisconsin. I thought that the Trump campaign had requested it and it was underway. But it turns out that it has not been authorized because the Trump campaign has not paid for the recount. Yeah, you got to pay cash up front. And there could be some politics here because back in 2016, there was a recount in Wisconsin and the cost was $2 million. The cost for a 2020 recount is $7.9 million. They say the costs are driven by coronavirus protocols, including the need for larger spaces to permit public observation. Oh, yeah, all those pesky Republican observers. So if the campaign requests the recount and coughs up the money, which appears unlikely to me, the recount would begin on Thursday and is required to be completed by December 1st under Wisconsin law. Over in Michigan, they are putting pressure on the bipartisan members of county boards of canvassers. And these are obscure posts. In each county, there are 4 members, 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans with staggered terms. And they basically have the job of certifying each county's numbers, and in turn, the state then bases its statewide certification on each county. And it's unclear to me that if you can get one big county to not deliver its canvassing certification, that you might be able to say the vote totals for the whole state must be thrown out, and we have to ask the legislature to compose a group of electors to send to the Electoral College. Now, in Michigan, Biden enjoys a lead of 148,000 votes. And the action appears to be in Wayne County, where the 2 Republicans have not committed to certifying the canvass. I believe it's not fully complete, so that may be a legitimate position. But if they fail to validate the Detroit count, the question of who won will effectively be referred to the state board, which has until December 13th to reach a final decision and send its electors to the college. So there's still some gaming going on. And while Trump and his lawyers haven't gotten much traction up to this point, hey, he's got a whole new cast of characters here. Rudy Giuliani, who allegedly is demanding $20,000 a day for his legal expertise. He's now in charge. So you know, it's going to be great. Again. Now to the Biden campaign. And because I'm only here for another week, I have decided not to go into detailed reaction to each appointment that is announced by the Biden campaign. But as I said earlier, it's going to be ugly. A lot of the common characters to Democratic administrations will be trotted out, some from the Wax Museum. And one of those is named Hillary Rodham Clinton. Apparently, there is a trial balloon that was floated to a Washington Post article yesterday that was buried 14 paragraphs in, suggesting that they might make Hillary Clinton the ambassador to the United Nations. Here's the voice of the Post. The thinking behind the move was that it would be a way for Biden to highlight the importance of that position in his administration, and that placing her there would raise the prestige of the UN itself at a time when global cooperation and the U.S. role on the world stage has ebbed. Well, come on. Do you think the rest of the world has forgotten about the shakedown system called the Clinton Foundation and the Clinton Global Initiative and the pay-to-play between the State Department when Hillary was secretary and the staff over at the Clinton Foundation? I certainly haven't forgotten. And do you think the world forgets her advocacy for the U.S. blunders in Libya and in Syria? And her previous expressions of contempt for the United Nations, which are just slightly less offensive than John Bolton's? Well, this is what we're going to get. And it's why I didn't vote for Joe Biden. All right, let's say something nice about Joe. He was asked by a reporter on Monday, did canceling student loan debt figure into his plans for the economy? Would he take executive action to do it? Biden, it does figure in my plan. Referring to student debt, it's holding people up. They're in real trouble. They have to make choices between paying their student loans, paying their rent, those kinds of decisions. It should be done immediately. All right, Joe, show your hand. That's promising. It would bring relief to a lot of Americans. That is for sure. Well, I want to take a moment here to quote some nice emails that I've received from listeners. Here's Robert Litwiller in Palo Alto. And Robert, have I called you Litweiler in the past? If so, I missed that second L in there. Robert says, I've been listening to your podcast since 2010, missing very few. I've been an annual subscriber since 2011. Your work has been unique in the strictest sense of the word. I've sampled around 100 podcasts in the last 10 years, still follow about 35, and haven't found anything that comes close to your combination of daily curated news with smart progressive comment, supplemented with great interviews. Along with your other followers, I'm certainly going to miss my daily serving of news and comment. Thank you, says Robert. You've earned a respite. I think it's okay to wish happy trails to someone who's still very much alive. I love happy trails. Anybody can wish me that. In fact, Bruce Klein does in this email. Oh, no, you're closing down just when I found your podcast again. I didn't have the money to subscribe to so much of my favorite podcasts or newspapers. I heard you subbing a long time ago on KGO. That's a talk station here in San Francisco. I recently found your podcasts on YouTube and then Apple Podcasts. And now I am so unhappy I didn't subscribe all along. You always pick the relevant stories, organize them well, add commentary that overlaps almost 100% with my point of view. I think I emailed you about my opinions on the Middle East, which is one place we hold slightly different opinions. Well, thank you, Bruce. I really appreciate that. Oh, and here's Keita Tom. And it's interesting because I've been hearing from Keita for years now, and I didn't know that she ran the legendary guitar store in Corvallis, Oregon. It's called the Fingerboard Extension. She says it's one of the last fretted instrument shops from the 1970s still in business. And she says she is trying to make a transition so that she can retire as well. And she goes all the way back to listening when I was on KRXA, and the show was syndicated into Oregon, in Portland, we weren't on in Corvallis, but we were on in Coos Bay. So maybe she picked it up online. Anyway, Keita, I really appreciate your note and your longtime support over the years. So we are winding down. The last news and comment podcast will be next Wednesday. Then after Thanksgiving, I will be bringing you a series of what I'm calling the last interviews, and I'm starting to record those over the next couple of days. I'm not going to wait till after Thanksgiving. I'll be posting them almost one a day for the foreseeable future. So just a couple of other pointers. If you have been a subscriber, I already have your email if you've been subscribing as recently as October. If I don't have your email, please send me an email if you'd like to be on my email alert list for future occasional podcast programs. When you write me, please share tips of other podcasts that you enjoy. Many listeners have asked for help in that department. And many people have gotten the word, but if you haven't, cancel your PayPal order. Otherwise, it'll keep sending me money every month, and, well, I don't want to take your money because I'm not going to be providing what you subscribed for. So thank you all. It means a lot to me. to hear the kind words of longtime listeners, and it validates the hard work that I've put in here on a daily basis for years. And I'm looking forward just to being free of the deadlines and see what happens. So Bret Stephens is not my favorite New York Times pundit, and he particularly annoyed me today. Column headline, Groupthink has left the left behind. And he refers to Greenwald and Andrew Sullivan, who have left their respective publications. And somehow from that, he extracts some sort of, problems with the left. But it's offensive to me because he thinks that Joe Biden is part of the left. He thinks that corporate Democrats are the left. He ignores that Democratic leaders have done everything they can to bury the progressive left in the party. And then he criticizes the whole lot for, this whole cancel culture. He says the new left is blind, it's black and white, doesn't have the nuance of the left of the past. And frankly, I don't think he knows what the hell he's talking about. But Norman Solomon does, and in his latest column over at Common Dreams, he says, corporate Democrats got the presidential nominee they wanted, along with control over huge campaign budgets and nationwide messaging to implement moderate strategies. But Joe Biden's victory came with no coattails down ballot. Democratic losses left just a razor-thin cushion in the House, and the party failed to win a Senate majority, at least so far. And he singles out for praise Detroit's Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib. She has pointed out that Democratic candidates in swing districts who openly supported progressive policies like Medicare for All and the Green New Deal all won their races. She said, we're not going to be successful if we're silencing districts like mine. Me not being able to speak on behalf of many of my neighbors right now, many of whom are black neighbors, means being silent. I can't be silent. And we've got to get the message to people like Connor Lamb and Abigail Spanberger, who believe that their frame for being a Democrat in a very Republican district is what has to define the whole party all across the country. Another quote from Solomon, while satisfying their impulses to blame the left for centrist failures, corporate Dems and their mildly progressive enablers, inside and outside of Congress, are striving to paper over basic fault lines. The absence of a functional public health system, the feeble government response to the climate emergency, the widening and deadly realities of income inequality, the systemic racism, runaway militarism, and so many other ongoing catastrophes are results of social structures that constrict democracy and serve oligarchy. Those who denounce the fight for a progressive agenda are telling us that, in essence, they don't want much to change. So today, Lindsey Graham's Senate Judiciary Committee held another Zoom-in presentation from Twitter's Jack Dorsey and Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg. And once again, this is just an opportunity for members of both parties to posture and demagogue, and very little came out of it. This is supposed to be a look back at the 2020 election and the positive and negative aspects of social media. Here's the narrative from the Washington Post. The first 90 minutes of the hearing crystallized long-running criticisms that Washington lawmakers are ill-equipped to take on large tech companies. Lawmakers circled around important issues about how the tech companies handled misinformation during the election, but they repeatedly failed to gain new information about whether the many new interventions tech companies applied were effective in cracking down on the spread of falsehoods and other inflammatory content. So nominally, the hearing was about making modifications to Section 230, which, as I've broken down many times, is the issue of whether Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube are publishers or merely platforms. Because they exercise so much control, restraint, and outright censorship over people's posts these days, I believe they are publishers and that the liability protection of Section 230 no longer applies. But instead, it was just putting the tech executives on the defensive. Zuckerberg basically in each of these hearings calls out for regulation. He's basically daring them to do it. And he even suggested that, well, let me quote a little bit at length here. We try to do what's best for our community and the world, acknowledging that there are difficult trade-offs. I believe that some of these trade-offs would be better made through a democratic process. He's saying, regulate me, you assholes. Oh, pardon me. One of the most substantive exchanges of the hearing, Zuckerberg recommended that any regulatory framework should require companies to issue transparency reports about the results and efficacy of their content moderation systems. I love all these tech euphemisms. That way, the people who are responsible for holding all of us accountable, Zuck said, whether it's journalists, Congress, academics, could have an apples-to-apples comparison of how all the other companies are doing and potentially as part of a law, require companies maintain a certain level of effectiveness. Well, I consider his comment here to be mostly empty calories. But he is screaming again, go ahead. Stop making me come up here and act defensively. Show us your regulation scheme. And I want to commend BuzzFeed because this is not the top 10 ways that Facebook failed to control people who called for armed gatherings on Facebook. The policy is related to whether the people who post what is called a call to arms are being properly monitored and policed. And as you know, I don't support censorship. But when people are using a public platform to say, come to Kenosha and bring your guns, that is calling fire in a theater. That is not, I believe, protected by any notion of the First Amendment. So on Monday, 15 Democratic senators sent a letter to Zuckerberg condemning Facebook for its abetting of violence and hate speech against Muslims and its failure to enforce the call to arms policy. And what we have learned is that there's very uneven enforcement of this call to arms policy. And in the case of Kenosha, there were 455 Facebook users who used the clunky system on Facebook to report concerns about the call for armed vigilantes in Kenosha on August 25th. But 4 of the content moderators decided that it was not in violation of any Facebook rules. And so we don't really have a clear understanding about how this content moderation, this selective censorship, this interference of a publisher actually works. We're just supposed to trust it, and clearly in Kenosha, we could not. You may have heard more and more about this new Facebook for haters and right-wingers and Trump lovers. They call it Parler. And Parler is the French word for to speak, parler. And I have not yet taken off my own blinders and visited Parler. But I do want to pass along to you what I've learned, that it is largely funded from the hedge fund of Robert Mercer and his daughter Rebecca. The same great people who supported Ted Cruz in 2016 and then Trump, and they bought Cambridge Analytica and put Steve Bannon in charge of it. Patriots, you would say, unless you're a thinking person. Here's today's COVID-19 update, prepared by Linda Lewis with my gratitude. The United States reported an additional 166,581 COVID cases on Monday. At least 796 people were reported dying from COVID or COVID-related conditions. We have averaged 155 cases over the past week, and the projections are that it will continue to climb. Worldwide, we have 55 million total cases, 1.3 million total deaths. Brazil has the second highest death toll. India comes in second in cases, third in deaths. Mexico has the fourth highest death toll, and Britain comes in behind that. Taking a look at the last 7 days in the United States, the top numbers of reported new infections are Illinois, Texas, California, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Indiana, Florida, and Pennsylvania. The average test positivity rate across the country is now at 4.6%. It edged over 5% in California, leading to new restrictions being announced. Essentially, we are going into a new lockdown, but they're not calling it a lockdown, and it's basically most of the same terms of what we experienced in April, May, and June of this year. Sweden has announced new restrictions on Monday to stem the spread of the virus. The Prime Minister, Stefan Löfven, announced a ban on public gatherings of more than 8 people. And he was pretty blunt. He said, don't go to the gym, don't go to the library, don't have dinner out, don't have parties, cancel. And starting Friday, Sweden will ban restaurants and bars from selling alcohol after 10 p.m., imposing new restrictions on nursing homes in and around Stockholm. And across Europe, the restrictions are more severe. The Biden team signaled Monday they don't plan to impose a national shutdown because of the economy. But Biden does want to coordinate, certainly, much more nationally than Trump has. I mean, Trump, it's a joke. He's gotten in the way of any kind of coordination over PPE, over ventilators when those were in short supply. A new Gallup poll says that 58% of Americans are willing to take a COVID-19 vaccine. The 58% represent a slight rebound in confidence. As recently as mid-September, it was about a 50-50 split. Maybe this is because they don't believe that Trump has been able to interfere in the process. But I believe the developments have been rushed under pressure from Trump and his minions. And my confidence level remains quite low. Republican governors are changing their tune. People like Kim Reynolds in Iowa, she has initiated a face mask requirement, but then says, we don't have enough cops to enforce it. North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum ordered residents to wear masks indoors and outdoors. North Dakota has the worst per capita new infection rate in the entire country. West Virginia Governor Jimmy Justice ordered residents to wear masks indoors starting on Saturday. And our Governor Newsom here, who had to apologize for violating his own rules by attending the birthday party of a lobbyist buddy of his that violated the rules, and he is still eating crow for that. He had said that he wanted to tap the brakes, and now he said he is pulling the emergency brake here in California. Chuck Grassley, the longest-serving Republican senator, age 87, he's quarantining after some exposure, we don't have the details, to someone with an active infection. And he will be out of the Senate for the foreseeable future. And the Washington Post reports in its backyard in Maryland and the District of Columbia, there are huge problems with unemployment payments, backlogs. It's true in California. It was true in Florida. I don't know if it's been fixed there. But the biggest failure is that the feds have failed to replenish the unemployment funds. Many people are going to go broke and become homeless in the very near future because of that gross inaction. So here are the details. North Dakota's coronavirus mortality rate is the highest of any state or country right now. It's at 18.2 deaths per million people. And following close behind, South Dakota, 17.4 deaths per million. Dr. Fauci has called for a more uniform approach instead of the state-by-state pandemic response. I guess he feels free to say this now that he's not directly under Trump's influence and hasn't been fired so far. Fauci said, "We need some fundamental public health measures that everyone should be adhering to, not a disjointed one state says one thing, the other state says another thing." Well, I support that kind of coordination, but I also support the states doing their own evaluations of coronavirus vaccines before they allow them to be distributed in those states. And the CDC has quietly removed controversial guidance from its website that pushed for schools to reopen and that downplayed the transmission of risks to children and others at school. One of them was reportedly written by political appointees outside the CDC, maybe at the White House. It had stated that children appear to be at lower risk for COVID-19 compared to adults, and children are unlikely to be major spreaders of the virus. It does appear that children are less likely to have a full-blown active infection with full symptoms. But that doesn't mean that they can't infect others. Yesterday, quoting from a dispatch from our friend Pepe Escobar, we talked a little bit about the new China-initiated Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the RCEP. And I'm running long here, so I'm just going to reference the article under the byline of Raul Diego, and I've linked to it at Mint Press News in the show file for today's podcast at peterbcollins.com. This is a stunning figure. Yesterday was the deadline for sexual abuse claims to be filed against the Boy Scouts of America. The number is stunning, 88,500 cases. Hey, QAnon, this is the real Pizzagate. Why don't you start shifting your focus to the Boy Scouts, to real pedophiles? Peru has a new leader for the third time in just over a week. The Congress chose a new leader who will be promoted to president in the wake of the resignation of the interim leader, Manuel Merino, who was plugged in after the elected president, legitimate president, Martin Vizcarra, who tried to clean up the Congress by removing criminal liability protection or immunity from the members of that parliament, more than half of whom are under investigation for potential crimes. So with that risk, the self-interest of the members of Congress led to the quickie impeachment of Vizcarra. They plugged in Merino, who quit after massive protests. And now the next guy in line is Francisco Sagasti, who is described as an engineer from the centrist Purple Party. And finally today, in the ballot box, November 3rd, voters in New Jersey, Arizona, and Montana, and South Dakota too, they all legalized the sale of cannabis for adult use, or what some people refer to as recreational pot. Voters in Mississippi overwhelmingly approved medical marijuana. 68% of Americans now favor legalization of cannabis. And get this, in South Dakota and Montana, where Republicans won just about everything, adult use marijuana passed with 16 percentage points more support than Joe Biden received. And Ralph Northam, the one-time blackface, now governor of Virginia, said that he will be introducing legislation in Virginia in January to legalize marijuana for adult use. This is a trend I like to see, and I'm going to confess that I have been buying marijuana from the black market for more than 40 years, and recently, availing myself of the relaxation of laws here in California, I actually purchased legal cannabis twice. And it feels better. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast, While They Last. You're free to share them all over the place. You'll find them on YouTube, and I am Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.